Dr. Han Jisoo stared at her computer screen in disbelief. The numbers didn't make sense. She had run the quantum entanglement experiment 50 times, and each time, the results showed something impossible. The clock on the laboratory wall showed 11:45 p.m. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, but Jisoo couldn't leave. Not when her equipment was showing that particles were appearing before they were created. She picked up her phone and called Dr. Kim Do-young, her mentor. Even though it was late, he answered on the second ring. "Do-young, I need you to come to the lab," she said. "Something strange is happening with the quantum particles." 20 minutes later, Do-young arrived at the university laboratory, his gray hair messy and his coat thrown on over his pajamas. He found Jisoo still sitting at her computer, running another test. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the screen. "The detector is recording the particle here, at point A, but it's creating the particle here, at point B, 3 microseconds later. It's like the particle exists before we make it." Do-young adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the screen. "Run it again," he said quietly. Jisoo started another test. They watched as the quantum particle appeared on their detectors, traveled through the experimental chamber, and then was created by their equipment, in that impossible order. "This breaks everything we know about cause and effect," Do-young said, rubbing his tired eyes. "We need more data, and we need help." The next morning, they called Park Sun-ho, their best graduate student, to the lab. Sun-ho was young and excited about everything, but even he became quiet when they showed him the results. "Could the equipment be broken?" Sun-ho asked, checking all the connections. "I tested everything twice," Jisoo said. "The equipment is working perfectly. The problem is with reality itself." They spent the whole day running more tests. Each time, the results were the same. The particles they created were showing up in their detectors before the machine made them. The time difference was tiny, just microseconds, but it was real. "We should write this down carefully," Do-young said. "Everything we do, everything we see. This could be the most important discovery in physics since Einstein." Jisoo nodded, but her hands were shaking as she typed her notes. If they were right, they had just discovered the first proof that time travel was possible. Even if it was just for tiny particles, even if it was just for microseconds, they had found something that scientists had thought was impossible. As the sun set outside their laboratory windows, the 3 scientists sat together, looking at their data. They had discovered something amazing. But Jisoo felt afraid. She knew that big discoveries could be dangerous. If they could make particles travel through time, what else might be possible? "We need to be careful," she said to Do-young and Sun-ho. "Very careful. We don't know what we're dealing with yet." Do-young agreed. "Tomorrow, we'll start building a proper theory to explain this. We'll need to understand exactly what's happening before we go any further." Sun-ho was already drawing diagrams on a whiteboard, trying to picture how a particle could travel backward in time. "This is amazing," he said. "We're going to be famous." Jisoo watched her young student's excitement and wished she could feel the same way. Instead, she felt like they had just opened a door that maybe should have stayed closed. But there was no going back now. They had found something incredible, and they had to understand it. As they left the lab that night, none of them knew that their discovery would soon change not just their lives, but our understanding of the universe itself. The journey that would test their friendship, their courage, and the very laws of physics had begun. 1 week after their strange discovery, Dr. Han Jisoo's laboratory had changed completely. The walls were now covered with equations and diagrams. 3 extra computers had been brought in to handle all the calculations they needed to do. Dr. Kim Do-young stood at a whiteboard, drawing another diagram. "Einstein told us that time isn't fixed," he explained to the team. "It can bend and stretch like a rubber band. But what we're seeing is different. Our particles aren't just bending time, they're jumping through it. Like a tunnel through time," Park Sun-ho asked, looking up from his computer. "More like a bubble," Jisoo said. "A space where cause and effect can work backward, but only for a few microseconds. The door opened, and a new person walked in. Dr. Lee Mirai was carrying a laptop and looked excited. The team had asked for her help because she was the best AI specialist at the university. They needed her computers to understand the huge amount of data they were collecting. "I think I found something interesting," Mirai said, setting up her laptop. "My AI programs have analyzed all your data, and there's a pattern. The time jumps aren't random. They follow a mathematical rule." Everyone gathered around her screen. Mirai showed them a graph where all their results made a perfect curve. "This means it's not an accident," Du Young said quietly. "The universe is allowing this to happen in a very specific way." Jisoo felt her heart beat faster. "If there's a rule, we can predict it. If we can predict it, we can control it." Sun Ho finished her sentence. They spent the next few hours writing equations and running computer models. Mirai's AI programs helped them understand things that would have taken months to figure out on their own. "Look at this," Jisoo said later that evening. "Einstein said that time and space are connected. They're really the same thing. And these equations show that our quantum particles are finding tiny holes in spacetime, like wormholes." Sun Ho asked. "Similar, but much smaller. We're calling them causality bubbles," Du Young explained. "Inside these bubbles, time can flow backward for just a few microseconds. It's like, imagine a river flowing downstream. Our particles are finding tiny whirlpools where they can swim upstream for a moment." Mirai typed quickly on her keyboard. "The AI predictions show we might be able to make these bubbles bigger. Not much bigger, but maybe big enough for larger particles." Suddenly, they heard a knock at the laboratory door. Professor Choi Ta-won, the head of their department, walked in. He looked serious. "I've been reading your preliminary reports," he said. "Are you absolutely sure about these results?" Jisoo showed him their latest data and Mirai's analysis. "We've checked everything many times, Professor. This is real." Professor Choi sat down heavily in a chair. "Then we need to talk about what happens next. This kind of discovery, it will change everything. And not everyone will want things to change." The excitement in the room turned to worry. They hadn't thought much about what would happen when the world learned about their discovery. "What should we do?" Jisoo asked. "For now, we keep working," Du Young said firmly. "We need to understand everything about these causality bubbles before we tell the world. No announcements, no papers, nothing until we're sure." As the team went back to their work, Jisoo noticed that Sun Ho looked troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked him quietly. "I was just thinking," he said. "If we can make these bubbles bigger, big enough for more than just particles, what would happen if a person went inside one?" Jisoo didn't answer. She had been wondering the same thing, but she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Not yet. Outside the laboratory windows, the city lights were coming on as night fell. Somewhere in the quantum realm, particles were still jumping backward through microseconds of time, following rules that humans were only beginning to understand. Professor Choi Ta-won called an emergency meeting early one morning, 2 weeks after the team had begun understanding their causality bubbles. The laboratory was quiet as everyone gathered around the conference table. "Word of your research is spreading," Professor Choi said, his face showing concern. "Other scientists are asking questions. We need to decide what to do next." Dr. Han Jisoo looked at her computer screen, where complex calculations showed their latest results. The causality bubbles were growing larger. What had started with single particles now worked with small molecules. "We should publish our findings," Dr. Kim Du-young said. "That's how science works. We share what we learn." Dr. Lee Mirai shook her head. "My AI systems have analyzed possible reactions to our discovery. The results are worrying. Many people will be afraid of time travel, even if it's just for molecules." Park Sun-ho had been quiet, which was unusual for him. He stood up suddenly. "We should test it with something bigger," he said. "Something alive." Everyone turned to look at him. The room became very quiet. "What do you mean?" Jisoo asked, although she feared she knew the answer. "I volunteer to be the first test subject," Sunho said firmly. "We've done all the calculations. We know the bubbles are safe for small things. Someone needs to take the next step." "Absolutely not," Do Young said sharply. "We don't know enough yet. It's too dangerous." "But we'll never know unless we try," Sunho argued. "Think about what this could mean for humanity. We could solve so many problems if we understand how to control time." Professor Choi stood up slowly. "There's something you all need to know," he said. His voice was heavy with worry. "Yesterday I received a call from the government. They've heard about our research. They want to know everything we've learned." Mei Rei's face turned pale. "The military?" "Yes," Professor Choi answered. "They're very interested in the potential applications." Jisoo felt sick to her stomach. She had been so excited about their discovery, so focused on understanding the science, that she hadn't thought enough about what might happen once others knew about it. "We can't let them take control of this," Sunho said. "That's why we need to move forward now, while we still can. Let me test the bubble. Just a few seconds into the future, we can prove it's possible." "Listen to yourself," Du Young said. "You're talking about risking your life. What if something goes wrong? What if you get stuck in the bubble? What if your atoms don't come back together properly?" Jisoo watched the argument continue. She saw the fear in Do Young's eyes, the determination in Sunho's face, the worry in Professor Choi's expression. She realized that their simple scientific discovery had become something much more complicated. "We need time to think," she said finally. "This isn't just about physics anymore. We're talking about changing the basic rules of reality. We need to be absolutely sure about what we're doing." But as they left the meeting, Jisoo noticed Sunho staying behind in the lab. He was looking at their testing chamber with an expression she had never seen before. It was a look of someone who had already made up his mind. That night, Jisoo couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Sunho's words, about the government's interest, about all the ways their discovery could change the world, for better or worse. The simple days of pure scientific research were over. Now they had to face the human side of their discovery, and that was proving to be much more complex than any physics equation. The testing chamber looked different now. Dr. Han Jisoo and her team had spent 3 weeks rebuilding it, making it larger and stronger. It was no longer just a small box for quantum particles. Now it was big enough to hold ordinary objects. "All systems are ready," Dr. Lee Mirei announced, checking her computer screens. "The AI predictions show a 98% chance of success." Dr. Kim Do-young placed a fresh red apple on the platform inside the chamber. They had chosen an apple because it was about the same size as their previous tests, but much more complex than simple molecules. "Remember," Do-young said, "we're only attempting a 5-minute jump forward. The apple should disappear when we activate the chamber and reappear exactly 5 minutes later." Professor Choi Ta-won watched from the corner, his face tense. He hadn't wanted them to move forward with larger tests so quickly, but he also knew they couldn't wait. The government was getting impatient for results. "Power levels are rising," Jisoo reported, watching the gauges carefully. "Causality bubble is forming." The air inside the chamber began to shimmer, like the heat waves above hot pavement. The apple sat in the center, looking small and ordinary under the bright laboratory lights. "Quantum field is stable," Mei Rei said. "Beginning temporal displacement in 3, 2, 1. There was a soft humming sound, and then a flash of blue light. When they looked again, the apple was gone. "First phase successful," Jisoo said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Now we wait 5 minutes." The laboratory became very quiet. Park Sun-ho watched the empty chamber with intense interest, taking notes about everything he saw. Small sparks of blue light occasionally flickered in the air where the apple had been. "Power consumption is much higher than we calculated," Do-young noted with concern. "The equipment is running hot." 3 minutes remaining, Mei Rei announced. Suddenly, all the lights in the laboratory flickered. The computers beeped in alarm. "Something's wrong," Jisoo said, checking her instruments. "The quantum field is becoming unstable." 2 minutes, Mayray called out. More blue sparks appeared in the chamber, bigger than before. The humming sound grew louder. "The power grid for the entire building is being affected," Professor Choi reported, looking at his phone. "Other departments are calling to ask what's happening." 1 minute, Mayray said. The humming reached a peak. The air in the laboratory felt strange, like just before a lightning strike. Everyone held their breath. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There was another flash of blue light. The apple reappeared exactly where it had been. But it wasn't the same. "Look," Sunho said, pointing at the chamber. The apple was now perfectly frozen, covered in a thin layer of frost. When they opened the chamber to examine it, they found that the inside of the fruit had aged 5 years, not 5 minutes. "This is impossible," Du Young said, cutting the apple open. Time passed differently inside and outside the apple. The quantum effects aren't uniform. Jisoo noticed something else. Small objects around the laboratory, pens, paper clips, coins, had moved slightly from their original positions. It was as if the space around the chamber had been disturbed. "The causality bubble affected more than just the apple," she said. "It changed things outside the chamber too. The effect is spreading." Professor Choi looked deeply worried. "We need to understand exactly what happened here before we try anything else. The risks are becoming too great." But Sunho was smiling. "Don't you see? It worked. We sent something through time. The problems can be fixed. We just need to adjust our calculations." As the team discussed their next steps, none of them noticed that the laboratory's wall clock was now running 2 seconds slower than all the other clocks in the building. The fabric of time itself was beginning to bend around their experiments. Dr. Han Jisoo hadn't left the laboratory for 3 days. After the apple experiment, she had been working nonstop to understand what had gone wrong. Dr. Lee Mirai stayed with her, running endless computer simulations. "I think I found something," Mirai said one morning, her eyes bright despite her exhaustion. "My quantum eye has discovered a pattern in the energy fluctuations. We've been using too much power in the wrong way." Jisoo looked at Mirai's computer screen. The AI had created a new mathematical model that showed how to form causality bubbles using much less energy. "Instead of forcing time to bend," Mirai explained, "we can let it fold naturally, like paper. The AI shows we only need to guide it in the right direction." Jisoo checked the calculations carefully. "This could work," she said. "We could reduce power consumption by 80%. The bubbles would be more stable too." They called the rest of the team to share their discovery. Dr. Kim Do-young arrived first, followed by Park Sun-ho and Professor Choi Ta-won. "Show them," Jisoo said to Mirai. As Mirai explained the AI's discovery, Do-young's face grew increasingly pale. He started writing equations on the whiteboard, his hands shaking slightly. "Stop," he said suddenly. "Everyone stop. There's something very wrong here." The room went quiet. Do-young kept writing, filling the whiteboard with complex mathematics. "The AI found a way to make time travel easier," he said, "but it missed something important. Look here." He pointed to his equations. "When we create these folded causality bubbles, we're not just bending time. We're splitting it." "What do you mean, splitting it?" Sunho asked. "Each time we make a bubble, we're creating a branch in time, a new timeline." Do-young's voice was serious. "It's like a river splitting into smaller streams. Every time we send something through time, we might be creating a whole new universe." Professor Choi stepped closer to examine the equations. "Are you certain about this?" "The math is clear," Do-young said. "It explains why the apple aged differently inside and out. It wasn't just traveling through time. It was crossing between timelines." Jisoo felt her stomach tighten. If this is true, then we're not just risking our experiments. We're risking reality itself. Mireille typed rapidly on her computer, asking her AI to analyze Du Young's equations. He's right, she said after a few minutes. The AI confirms it. Every causality bubble has been creating microscopic parallel universes. But they're so small, they collapse almost instantly, Sun Ho said, looking at the data. That's why we haven't noticed them before. Yes, with particles and molecules, Du Young agreed. But what happens if we try something bigger? Something human-sized? We could create a permanent split in reality. Professor Choi sat down heavily in a chair. We have to stop the experiments. The risks are too high. But before anyone could respond, all the lights in the laboratory suddenly went out. When they came back on a few seconds later, everyone noticed something strange. The clock on the wall was running backward. What's happening? Sun Ho asked, his voice shaking. Jisoo rushed to check their instruments. The quantum effects from our experiments are spreading, she said. All our tests, all those tiny universe splits, they're starting to add up. Time itself is becoming unstable. Through the laboratory windows, they could see other buildings on campus. In one window, a bird flew backward. In another, leaves fell upward from the ground to their trees. We didn't just discover time travel, Du Young said quietly. We discovered how to break time itself. Professor Choi Ta-won called an emergency meeting at his home rather than the laboratory. After the strange events on campus, they needed a safe place to talk. The professor's living room was small but comfortable, with books covering every wall. I received 2 important phone calls today, Professor Choi said, his voice grave. The first was from the Ministry of Defense. The second was from an old friend at another university. What I learned changes everything. Dr. Han Jisoo sat next to Dr. Kim Du Young on the professor's old couch. Dr. Lee Mi-rae took notes on her laptop, while Park Sun-ho stood by the window, watching the street outside. Other research teams are working on time travel, Professor Choi continued. Not just in our country, but in many others. Some have already made progress similar to ours. How is that possible? Jisoo asked. We only made our discovery a few weeks ago. Professor Choi's face showed deep worry. Because I wasn't completely honest with you before. 20 years ago, I worked on a secret government project. We found the first hints of these causality bubbles, but we couldn't control them. The project was shut down after there was an accident. The room became very quiet. Even Sun Ho turned away from the window to listen. What kind of accident? Du Young asked softly. An entire research facility disappeared. Professor Choi answered. Just vanished, with 23 people inside. They never found any trace of them. After that, the government decided it was too dangerous and stopped the research. But other countries continued in secret. Mi-rae's fingers had stopped moving over her keyboard. And now they're all close to success. Yes, Professor Choi said. My friend tells me that several military organizations are only months away from achieving controlled time displacement. They want to use it as a weapon. A weapon? Sun Ho's voice was shocked. How? Think about it, Du Young said. Soldiers who could move through time. Missiles that could strike before they're launched. The ability to know your enemy's plans before they make them. Jisoo stood up and walked to Professor Choi's bookshelf. She picked up an old physics textbook, remembering simpler days when time travel was just an interesting theory to discuss in class. We have to make a choice, she said. We can either shut down our project completely, or we can finish it first. Sun Ho finished her sentence. Find a way to prove it's too dangerous for anyone to use. Mi-rae opened a new file on her laptop. My AI models show that if multiple groups achieve time travel capability at the same time, the risk of timeline collapse increases by 4,000%. Then we don't have a choice, Du Young said. We have to continue our work. We have to find a way to prove that large-scale time travel will destroy reality itself. It's the only way to stop everyone from trying. Professor Choi walked to his window and looked out at the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "If we continue," he said, "we'll be racing against time itself, and we'll be putting ourselves in terrible danger." "We're already in danger," Jisoo said. "The whole world is. We started this. We have to finish it." They spent the rest of the evening making plans. They would return to the laboratory tomorrow. But now they had a new purpose. They weren't just scientists exploring an interesting phenomenon anymore. They had become the last hope of protecting time itself from those who would try to control it. Time was behaving strangely in the laboratory. Dr. Han Jisoo noticed it first when she saw that her coffee stayed hot for 3 hours without warming it. Dr. Lee Miray's computer showed that files were being saved before she typed them. The fabric of reality was starting to tear. "The quantum disturbances are getting worse," Dr. Kim Do-young said, checking their instruments. "We have perhaps 2 days before the effects become permanent." Miray's quantum AI was working at full capacity, trying to find a way to prove that time travel would destroy reality. The computer's cooling fans were so loud they had to raise their voices to be heard. "Other research teams are close to success," Professor Choi Ta-won reported, hanging up his phone. "My contacts say at least 3 different military groups are preparing their first human tests." Jae-soo looked at their testing chamber. They had modified it according to Miray's new calculations, hoping to create a controlled demonstration of how time travel could break the universe. But something wasn't working right. "The simulations keep failing," Miray said, frustration clear in her voice. "Every time we try to model a large temporal displacement, the computer crashes. It's like reality itself refuses to be calculated." Park Sun-ho had been unusually quiet all morning. He sat in the corner, writing in his notebook and occasionally glancing at the testing chamber. Jisoo noticed dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept. "Maybe we're thinking about this wrong," Sun-ho said suddenly. "We keep trying to prove the danger through mathematics and computers. But what if we need actual evidence?" "What do you mean?" Do-young asked, though his face suggested he already knew. "We need to show them what happens when a person tries to time travel. Not just calculations or theories. Real proof." Sun-ho stood up, his decision clear in his eyes. "No," Jisoo said firmly. "We already discussed this. It's too dangerous." But Sun-ho walked to the testing chamber. "I've been studying the calculations all night. I made some adjustments to the system. I can prove it's too dangerous, once and for all." Before anyone could stop him, Sun-ho opened the chamber door. Professor Choi moved to intercept him, but he wasn't fast enough. "Sun-ho, wait," Miray shouted. Her computer screen was flashing with warning messages. "The AI predictions show a 99% chance of catastrophic failure." "That's exactly what we need to prove," Sun-ho said, stepping into the chamber. "Sometimes the only way to prevent a disaster is to show people what it looks like." Jisoo ran to the chamber controls. "If you do this, you might not just die. You could erase yourself from existence. You could create a paradox that destroys everything." "Then stop me," Sun-ho said quietly. "Find another way to prove it. Find it in the next 30 seconds, or I'm going to activate the chamber myself." The team looked at each other in desperation. 30 seconds wasn't enough time to find another solution. They had worked for weeks without success. But letting Sun-ho risk himself, risk all of reality, was unthinkable. The laboratory lights began to flicker. Through the windows, they could see strange colors in the sky. Time was running out, in more ways than one. They had to make a decision, and they had to make it now. Park Sun-ho pressed the activation button inside the chamber. Dr. Han Jisoo screamed no, but it was too late. The familiar blue light filled the room, brighter than ever before. Time seemed to stop. Dr. Kim Do-young saw drops of his coffee frozen in the air where he had knocked over his cup. Dr. Lee Miray's computer screen showed all possible calculations happening at once. Professor Choi Ta-won stood perfectly still, his hand reaching out toward the chamber. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of disappearing, Sun-ho remained visible in the chamber. But now there were multiple versions of him, like reflections in a broken mirror. Each version was doing something slightly different. Some were stepping forward, others backward. Some were frozen in place. The chamber is showing all possible timelines at once, Mayray whispered, watching her computer's readings. Every choice, every possibility, all happening together. Suddenly, all the versions of Sunho spoke in unison. Now I understand. The multiple images began to merge back together. The blue light faded, and a single Sunho stepped out of the chamber. He looked exactly the same, but somehow different. His eyes held a strange, distant look. I saw everything, he said quietly. All the possible futures, all the different paths, and I saw why large-scale time travel can never work. What did you see? Jisoo asked, helping him to a chair. The universe protects itself, Sunho explained. When something too big tries to move through time, reality splits into all possible versions of that event. But it can't maintain those splits. They collapse back together, canceling each other out. It's like trying to dig a hole in water. The hole fills itself immediately. Do-young rushed to the whiteboard and began writing equations. Of course, he said. That's why our particle experiments worked, but the apple aged strangely. Small things can slip through time's defenses, but anything larger triggers this protection mechanism. Mayray's computer suddenly came back to life. The AI confirms it, she said. The mathematics predicts exactly what Sunho experienced. Time travel is only possible at the quantum level. Anything larger creates a paradox that the universe automatically corrects. Professor Choi picked up his phone. We need to tell everyone. All the other research teams, all the military projects. They need to know that their experiments will never succeed. They won't have to take our word for it, Jisoo said, looking at their instruments. The readings from Sunho's experience provide perfect proof. The data shows exactly why human-scale time travel is impossible. The strange effects that had been happening around the laboratory began to fade. The displaced objects returned to their proper places. The clocks synchronized themselves. Outside, the sky returned to its normal color. The universe wasn't breaking, Do-young realized. It was showing us how it protects itself. All those strange events were just time healing its own wounds. Sunho smiled tiredly. So we succeeded, didn't we? We proved that time travel is possible according to physics, but we also proved that the universe won't allow it to be misused. Professor Choi nodded. You took an incredible risk, Sunho, but you helped us understand one of the greatest mysteries of physics. The universe has rules, and one of those rules is that time must flow forward for anything larger than a quantum particle. As the team began writing up their findings, Jisoo looked at their testing chamber one last time. It seemed smaller now, less mysterious. They had started their research hoping to control time itself. Instead, they had learned that some things were beyond human control, and that was exactly how it should be.